1071, the Seljuk Turks destroyed a Byzantine army at Manzikert. The emperor sent a letter to Rome, not for conquest, but for help. Pope Urban II turned that letter into a war. At Clermont in 1095, he preached a sermon that emptied Europe. Hundreds of thousands answered. Most died before they saw Jerusalem. The People's Crusade reached Constantinople and was destroyed within weeks. The armies of the First Crusade, Norman, French, Flemish, fought their way across Anatolia. They took Antioch after a 7-month siege. They starved. They suffered. They did not stop. On 15 July 1099, they breached the walls of Jerusalem. What followed was a massacre. And then, silence. The holy city had fallen. The impossible had been achieved. Now came the harder question. What do you do with a kingdom you have no idea how to keep? The gates of Jerusalem had barely closed before the killing began. Not the killing of enemies, the killing of neighbors. Within 72 hours of the city's fall, the men who had marched 2,000 miles in the name of God were arguing over who owned it. The holy city, the eternal prize, the reason for everything. And the question was already, whose? Here is the paradox at the heart of this story. The Crusaders had achieved the impossible. They had taken Jerusalem. They had carved 4 kingdoms out of a land that had never been theirs. They had built castles on ridges where Roman legions once marched. They had planted their flags in the soil of the ancient world and called it home. And yet, from the very first morning, they were dying. Not from a single catastrophic defeat, not from one decisive battle. They were dying the slow death of something that does not belong. Something built on sand. Something that required the entire Muslim world to remain divided, distracted, and weak, forever, in order to survive. It did not remain weak forever. 4 kingdoms, 45 years, and a silence in the Muslim world that could not hold forever. The silence after conquest is never peaceful. It is the silence of calculation. In the weeks after Jerusalem's fall in July 1099, the Crusader leaders faced a question they had never adequately prepared for. Now that they had it, what were they going to do with it? Godfrey of Bouillon was offered the crown. He refused the title of king, accepting instead the designation Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. To wear a crown of gold, he said, where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, would be a blasphemy. It was the kind of statement that sounds like piety and functions as politics. Godfrey ruled for exactly 1 year. In July 1100, he died. Disease, most likely, the same invisible enemy that had claimed tens of thousands of crusaders on the march. He was perhaps 40 years old. He left no heir, no clear successor, and a city of 40,000 souls in an alien land, surrounded by enemies on every side. His younger brother, Baldwin, Count of Edessa, the man who had actually been running things in the north, rode south immediately. Baldwin I did not refuse the crown. He was crowned King of Jerusalem on Christmas Day 1100 in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. It was a coronation of extraordinary symbolism, the first king of the New Jerusalem, crowned in the birthplace of Christ. The ceremony was immaculate. The reality behind it was more complicated. Baldwin I inherited a kingdom of roughly 100,000 people
in a land that had known Islamic rule for 4 centuries. The Muslim population vastly outnumbered the Crusader settlers. The Italian merchant republics, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, were already extracting trade concessions in exchange for naval support. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt controlled the southern coast. The Seljuk Turks held the interior. Jerusalem itself, stripped of its Muslim and Jewish populations, was a city of perhaps 15,000. Most of them had arrived in the previous 12 months. Baldwin understood, as Godfrey perhaps had not, that survival required more than faith. It required strategy. He began to build. What emerged from the First Crusade was not one kingdom, it was 4. The Kingdom of Jerusalem anchored the south, the Holy City itself, the port of Jaffa, and a coastal strip stretching north toward Acre. Powerful enough to be the symbolic center, too small to be militarily self-sufficient. The county of Tripoli occupied the narrow coastal plain of modern Lebanon. The city of Tripoli, the mountains, and the vital roads connecting north to south. It would take until 1109 for Tripoli itself to fall to the Crusaders. For a decade, the county existed as territory without a capital. The Principality of Antioch held the Syrian coast and the mouth of the Orontes River. It was Bohemond of Taranto's creation, or rather, his inheritance, won by arms and held by will.
Antioch was ancient, wealthy, cosmopolitan. It was also on the front line of everything that came from the north and east. The county of Edessa was the most exposed, the most isolated, and, in retrospect, the most predictable casualty. It lay beyond the Euphrates, in modern southeastern Turkey, a Frankish island in a sea of Armenians, Kurds, Arabs, and Turks. No natural buffer, no coastal access, no easy line of supply or retreat. Edessa was a city held by courage and hope, and not much else. These 4 states were the Frankish presence in the east, what later generations would call outre-mer, French for beyond the sea. They shared borders, they shared enemies. They did not always share interests.
Baldwin I spent the first decade of his reign building the sinews of his kingdom. He captured Acre in 1104, Sidon in 1110, Beirut in 1110, one port at a time, each one extending Jerusalem's reach and reducing its isolation. He relied on the Venetian fleet, trading commercial privileges for warships. It was not a noble arrangement, it was a necessary one. By 1115, the 4 Crusader states formed a continuous coastal chain, from Edessa in the north to the Sinai in the south, roughly 900 kilometers of defended territory. On a map, it looked impressive. On the ground, it was a permanent emergency.
Something unexpected happened in the decades after the conquest. The Crusaders did not leave. The assumption in Jerusalem and Rome and Constantinople had been that the crusade would succeed and the victorious knights would return home. Many did, but many others stayed and began, improbably, to build lives. They built castles. The Crusader fortifications of this period are among the most sophisticated military architecture in medieval history. Croix de Chevaliers, Belvoir, Carac, Montfort. Massive limestone fortresses on ridges, designed to be held by small garrisons against large armies. Walls 12 meters thick, interior cisterns, concentric defenses. They were not decorative. They were survival infrastructure. They built a legal system. The Assizes of Jerusalem, a body of Crusader law, governed land tenure, inheritance, disputes between lords, and relations between the Frankish settlers and the local population. It was a feudal system transplanted to the Levant and adapted under pressure. They built relationships. This is the part the chronicles understate and the history books argue about. The Franks of Outremer were not the same people as the Franks of France. Within a generation, many had never seen Europe. They spoke Arabic alongside French. They ate local food. They employed local craftsmen. Some negotiated truces and trading arrangements with Muslim neighbors. A few, a very few, married into local Christian families of Syrian or Armenian descent.
A new culture was beginning to emerge. Cautious, hybrid, fragile. Usama ibn Munkith, a Syrian nobleman and writer who knew the Crusaders personally, left descriptions of remarkable complexity. Franks he liked, Franks he despised, Franks who seemed, to his eyes, almost civilized, and Franks who had just arrived from Europe and knew nothing. The Franks who have just come from their homelands are rougher in character than those who have been here long. It was an observation that cut to the heart of Outremer's problem. The culture that was slowly forming required time. Time was the one resource the Crusader States never had enough of.
In 1119, a French knight named Hugh de Payens approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal. He and 8 companions, he explained, wished to dedicate themselves permanently to the protection of pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem. The roads were dangerous. Bandits, Bedouin raiders, and opportunistic soldiers preyed on the thousands of Christian pilgrims who made the journey each year, many of whom died before reaching the Holy City. De Payens' proposal was simple: a permanent brotherhood of warrior monks, men bound by monastic vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, but carrying swords, fighting not for personal glory or land or wealth, but for God and the defense of Christendom. Baldwin II gave them quarters on the Temple Mount in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders believed stood on the site of Solomon's Temple. From this, they took their name, the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. History would call them the Knights Templar.
The idea was revolutionary. Monastic life and military life had been considered incompatible. One was the renunciation of the world, the other its most brutal engagement. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his generation, resolved the contradiction in an 1136 treatise in praise of the new knighthood. The Templar, Bernard argued, was not guilty of homicide when he killed in service of God. He was performing malicide, the killing of evil. It was theology engineered to serve military necessity. The Templars received their formal papal sanction at the Council of Troy in 1129. They were granted extraordinary privileges. They answered to the Pope alone, paid no local taxes, could cross any border, and kept all spoils of war. Within 2 decades, donations from across Europe had made them wealthy beyond their founders' imagination. The warrior monks who had begun in borrowed quarters on the Temple Mount became one of the most powerful institutions in the medieval world.
The Hospitallers, the Order of St. John, had existed before the Templars as a charitable institution caring for sick pilgrims. Under the influence of the Templar model, they militarized in the 1130s, taking on a combat role while maintaining their hospital function. Black surcoat, white cross. A different uniform, the same logic. These 2 orders would become the permanent military backbone of Outremer, the standing army the Crusader States could never otherwise afford to maintain. They would also, in time, become powers unto themselves, arguing with kings, fighting their own private wars, accumulating land and wealth across the whole of Christendom. They were simultaneously the best thing that happened to the Crusader States and a seed of the dysfunction that would help destroy them.
The Islamic Near East, 1099 to 1127. Here is what the history books sometimes obscure. When Jerusalem fell in 1099, the Muslim world did not mobilize. It did not rally. It did not even, for several years, fully respond. The reason is not cowardice or indifference. The reason is structural. The Islamic Near East of 1099 was not a unified civilization under unified command. It was a fractured landscape of competing powers, personal rivalries, and theological divisions that made common action nearly impossible. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was the nominal spiritual authority of Sunni Islam, but the Abbasid Caliph held no real military power. Real power had long since passed to the Seljuk sultans, and the Seljuk Sultanate was itself fragmenting. After the death of Malik Shah in 1092, the empire had splintered into competing principalities ruled by his sons and their successors. Mosul, Aleppo, Damascus, and a dozen smaller cities each had their own ruler, their own ambitions, and their own enemies.
Meanwhile, the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo was Shia, and therefore considered heretical by the Sunni Seljuks. The two caliphates did not cooperate. They competed. Jerusalem had been under Fatimid control until just weeks before the Crusaders arrived. The Seljuks had barely seized it when the Crusaders took it from them. Neither power had the time, the unity, or the will to mount a serious response. The Crusader States, in other words, were built not merely on Christian arms, but on Muslim division. Every year that the Muslim world remained fragmented was a year that Outremer survived. And so, for a generation, the response to the Crusader presence was localized and piecemeal. Damascus occasionally raided. Egypt probed the southern coast. Individual Turkish emirs launched attacks on exposed positions. But no coalition formed. No unified command emerged. The Crusader states exploited every gap, every rivalry, every moment of distraction. This could not last. It did not last.
Imad ad-Din Zengi, 1127 to 1144. His name meant the pillar of the faith. He had earned it the way men earned names in the 12th century, in blood, on horseback, through a combination of tactical brilliance and spectacular ruthlessness. Imad ad-Din Zengi was born around 1085, the son of a Seljuk military commander. He grew up in the brutal school of Turkish military politics, a world where ambition was legitimate if you survived it, and treachery was expected from all directions. He rose through military service, command, and calculated loyalty to those who could advance him. In 1127, he was appointed Atabeg, governor of Mosul. He was approximately 40 years old. He was also, for the first time, in a position to begin what he clearly understood as a mission: the reunification of Muslim Syria under a single command.
He moved with controlled aggression. Aleppo fell to him in 1128. With Mosul and Aleppo united, he controlled the two major cities of northern Syria and the routes between them. He was now a regional power of the First Order, and his eyes were on the Crusader States. Zengi was not a religious idealist. He was a soldier politician. The jihad, the holy war, was a language he spoke fluently, but he spoke it in the service of power. He was feared by his own troops as much as by enemies. Ibn al-Athir, the great Arab chronicler, records that Zengi executed subordinates who failed him, personally oversaw executions, and maintained discipline through terror.
His own soldiers would not relieve themselves at night for fear of what he might think they were doing. And yet, the same Ibn al-Athir calls him the pillar of the Muslims when writing of his later victories. History accommodates the complicated. Zengi spent the years from 1128 to 1144 in a relentless campaign of expansion and consolidation. He fought the Crusaders, capturing the fortress of Atharib in 1130, raiding the territory of Antioch repeatedly. He fought Damascus, trying and largely failing to absorb it into his domain. Damascus preferred independence and would, when necessary, ally with the Crusaders against him. He fought Armenian princes, Turkish rivals, and any lesser lord who stood between him and the unified Syria he intended to create. The
the Crusader States watched him with growing alarm. They had built their survival on Muslim division. Here, at last, was a Muslim leader building Muslim unity, slowly, piece by piece, but building it.
24 December, Christmas Eve, 1144. The city of Edessa sat on its hill in what is now southeastern Turkey, ancient, walled, Armenian in character, but Frankish in governance since 1098. It was the oldest of the Crusader states. It was also, by 1144, the most exposed. Count Jocelyn II of Edessa was not the man his predecessors had been. He preferred the comforts of his estates along the Euphrates to the frontier garrison life that Edessa demanded. When Zengi moved north with his army in late November 1144, Jocelyn was absent. The garrison was under strength. The walls were old. Zengi arrived before the city on 28 November. He had brought engineers, the best siege engineers in the Islamic world, men who understood the mathematics of walls and the chemistry of fire. He set them to work immediately.
The siege lasted 28 days. The defenders sent desperate messages south to Jerusalem, north to Antioch, east to anyone who might come. No relief force came. Jerusalem was too far. Antioch had its own problems. The roads were held by Zengi's outriders. On 24 December 1144, Christmas Eve, the walls of Edessa were breached. Zengi's soldiers poured through the gap. The Latin Christian population, perhaps a few thousand Frankish settlers among a much larger Armenian and Syrian Christian community, tried to flee toward the citadel. In the crush, hundreds were trampled. The citadel held briefly, then it too fell. The county of Edessa, the first Crusader state, the northernmost outpost of Outremer, the state that had survived longer than anyone had any right to expect, ceased to exist in a single afternoon.
Zengi entered the city. The Armenian and Syrian Christians, native Christians, not Franks, he treated with relative restraint. The Frankish population had already fled or been killed. The city was returned to Islamic governance. In Europe, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Jerusalem itself had not fallen, but the first piece of the Crusader edifice had been torn away. If Edessa could fall, what could not? The Pope, Eugenius III, received the news and began composing what would become one of the most consequential letters of the century. He wrote to the King of France. He wrote to the King of Germany. He wrote to Bernard of Clairvaux. He was calling for a second crusade.
Zengi did not live to see what he had started. In 1146, 2 years after Edessa, he was murdered by his own servants while sleeping. A private assassination in the night. No great battle, no final reckoning. He died as he had lived, in a world where trust was a luxury and survival was never guaranteed. But what he had done could not be undone. He had proven something that the entire Muslim world had been arguing about for 45 years, that the Crusader states were not eternal, that they could be broken, that the walls they had built, the castles they had raised, the kingdoms they had planted in the soil of the Levant, these things could be taken back. One piece had already gone. The men who would take the rest were watching, learning. In the courts of Mosul and Damascus, a new generation was growing up. Men who had been raised not with the shock of Jerusalem's fall, but with the memory of Edessa's recovery. Men for whom the Crusaders were not an incomprehensible foreign force, but a known enemy with known weaknesses. One of them was not yet 20 years old. Salahuddin was not yet ready, but the world that would make him had just changed forever.